DA claims that the current minimum wage isn't financially sustainable for small as well as medium-sized companies and is a hindrance to job creation. This as workers struggle to make ends meet due to the rising cost of living driven by the high inflation. Right, let's speak now to Cosatu's parliamentary coordinator, Matthew Parks, as well as the DA's Matthew Cuthbert. Let's begin with you, Matthew Cuthbert. The DA, I'm sure this is part of a broader economic policy that you are proposing, but an integral part of it. What are the main pillars of your economic policy?
Thanks very much, Thabo, and it's great to be with you on your show this evening. We have a broader policy. This is obviously one of the measures in reforming the draconian labor regime that we have in place in this country. And the other measures are making sure that we save better and spend better from a fiscal point of view, making sure that we have responsible monetary policy, making sure that we have industries that grow and not certain companies or sectors that are protected because they are uncompetitive locally. We also need to expand our market access across the world and make sure that competition policy enables everyone to have fair market competition. And I think specifically regarding this policy, it's most important to recognize that we have one of the highest unemployment rates in the world, at north of 40% if you include discouraged work seekers. We have more than 7 out of 10 young people who are unemployed, and we believe it's critical to pull this lever so that we can get young people into employment and make sure that they are less reliant on the state, able to get their foot into the door of employment, earn experience, earn a wage, and be able to move up the opportunity ladder. And that's why we've put forward this policy proposal.
Yeah, we're hoping to get young people also to weigh in, and maybe any other people who are out of employment. 072-110-5584. The question is, would you be willing to work for less than the minimum wage? Would you be willing to work for less than the minimum wage? You can weigh in. We'll take your WhatsApp messages as well today for the DA. Let's stay with the DA for a little bit longer. I'll come to Cosatu in a moment. What are you reforming with this suggestion of the slashing of the minimum wage, or at least doing nothing with it and hoping that inflation will deal with it and it will disappear?
So our first measure is to introduce what we call a Youth Employment Opportunity Certificate, and this allows long-term unemployed youth of more than 12 months to actually go to a company and say, I would like to forego the minimum wage for a certain period of time, so that they're able to get experience and get their foot in the door. The thing is that the longer you've been unemployed, the less likely you are to ever be employed. And we've seen a number of people, particularly in their 30s, into their 40s, who've never had a job and never able to have the dignity of earning money. And that's why we think it's critical that we allow people to use their own individual agency for them to actually access employment. Secondly, we propose keeping the current minimum wage in place and not raising it any further. And we believe that over time, progressively, this will enable more people to enter the labor market rather than trying to price them out of the market. We need to understand that employers will only hire for the value they will seek in a particular employee. And if that is at 4,000 Rand as it currently stands, it will be difficult for that individual to be able to get that job if they don't add that kind of value. Ultimately, what the ANC and the allies at Cosatu and the SACP have done is, in effect, confine 10 million people to a 0% wage or a 0 Rand wage. And that puts people in a particularly difficult situation in a context of high poverty, high inequality. And ultimately, we need to get more people into jobs, and we need to make people less reliant on the state.
Cosatu's view, Matthew, what is it on this? Giving up the higher wage in lieu of experience, and that companies do not view inexperienced, especially young people at this particular point, worth 4,000 Rands.
Yeah. Look, good evening to Matthew. Look, it's a useful reminder that the DA just simply has no compassion, actually hates workers, and hates workers' rights. And this is not a new thing. It's a bit of a bizarre economic theory that says, let's pay people less and somehow grow the economy. So we're not sure what economic logic guides it, except impoverishing people. We've experimented with paying people a slave wage during the party era. It never had full employment. The economy didn't grow. Other countries, if we look across Africa, they don't have a minimum wage, yet they are deep, deep in poverty. Let's ask ourselves from an economic productivity stance. If a worker can't afford to pay for transport, he must walk to work for 2 hours. Will he be, when he gets to work, will he be productive? Because he'll be exhausted. That's what happened in the party era. If a worker can't afford to buy food, how exactly is he going to be productive at that workplace? If he's earning so little, he can't buy the products the company employs. who exactly is going to buy those products? So it makes no economic sense, makes no moral sense in a country which is still scarred by the deep legacy of apartheid, of inequality, of poverty. Makes no sense. If we look across the world, and it's a pity that the DA hasn't done any real research on it. If they had simply done what the government, what business and what Labour did at NEDLAC, when he discussed in great detail what a minimum wage is and what level should be pegged at, we had actually looked at international experience from the US, a well-developed country, Europe, also developed, to Brazil, a country with similar challenges as ourselves, and actually show that minimum wage is a major way to reduce poverty and inequality. It's actually a way to grow the economy, because when you put money into workers' pockets, they don't put it under a mattress, etc. They go and buy food, they pay for transport, they buy clothes, etc. So there's a stimulus into the local economy. If the DA had bothered to do a little bit of desktop research, they could have asked the Minimum Wage Commission, where business sits, government and labour, and academic experts. They did an extensive research by the University of Cape Town, by University of Stellenbosch, so not exactly radical institutions, who have actually shown that there's been no significant job losses since minimum wage was introduced. We'd actually pegged the minimum wage deliberately for domestic workers and for farm workers when it came into effect in 2019, just to check, will there be job losses? They were pegged as slightly less as farm and domestic workers. There wasn't. And in fact, we've seen employment actually beginning to increase. The reason why we're struggling with unemployment is because of load shedding, because of dysfunctional municipalities, because of aging infrastructure, the challenge at Transnet Freight Rail, at the port, etc. It's not because you pay people not even a living wage, just an absolute minimum.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit hypocritical for those who are wealthy, who sit in Parliament, earning over R1 million a year, to bleat about a domestic worker earning R27.58 an hour. That's a little bit hypocritical. But look, we can't be surprised, and I think we appreciate the honesty of the DA, who have always consistently in Parliament since 1994, always voted against every single protection for workers. And they will believe that this is some sort of draconian regime. Is not.
Yeah.
It's paid maternity leave for mothers who give birth to the child so they can take care of the child for 4 months. It's now paid paternity leave for a father to bond with the child. It's about sick leave, about paid overtime, about weekends off and so forth. It's about working in a safe workplace environment. It's about equal pay for equal work.
Yeah.
So what exactly about those labor rights is offensive? Because we're not the only country to have them. The US has them, Europe has them, Brazil has them, many other countries have them. So we're not sure which economic theory said, let's race to the bottom to improve the economy. It doesn't work that way. You have to do the obstacles to the economy, not simply choose to pay the least paid even less.
So Matthew Parks, address this question of if somebody is sitting at zero wage, would they mind getting a 3.5 wage from a zero wage?
So is the way to grow the economy, is it based on exploiting the desperation of the poorest of the poor? We've actually had workers who earn so little nowadays, and they spend so much of the money on transport that they actually say it no longer makes sense for them to go and work at a supermarket because they're going to spend more on transport than what they'll earn as a salary. So that's not the way to address it. Yeah. We can't have a race to the bottom, because then you might as well give up. You might as well then say, look, government, don't build houses. Let's build shacks for everybody, because we'd rather have more people in shacks than have people in houses. The way to address the thing is to grow the cake, not to cut the cake even smaller and smaller, because a restaurant is not going to hire additional people if it only has 10 tables.
Yes,
petrol station is not going to hire additional petrol attendants because it's only got 6 petrol pumps. It's going to hire based upon what it needs, and it'll play with the profit as it seeks. But again, let's unpack the DA's hypocrisy a little bit. Parliament recently passed the Companies Amendment Bill, and it said, can the CEOs of the big companies, the listed companies, the DA's stronghold base, can they just disclose their obscene salaries to their shareholders in the annual company reports, just as a way of pricking at the conscience to begin to reduce the apartheid wage gap, which is one of the objectives of the minimum wage in the first place? The DA said, no, they can't do that. It's unfair to the CEOs. Why should we pick on the CEOs? Yet you have a CEO of London making R300 million a year, fighting with mine workers for an extra R150 a month. We have the banking CEOs making R150,000 every single day of the year. Yet a cashier would be lucky to earn that in 2 years. So we have to address the inequalities of apartheid. We can't simply be content to have the very wealthy in Constantia and absolutely poverty stricken in Manenberg and Khayelitsha.
All right. Let's bring the Democratic Alliance back in, Matthew. It's not the way to address unemployment. You don't cut the minimum wage, you expand the cake and get more people employed. That's one area that I want you to address. The second area is that there has been no job losses since the minimum wage was introduced. And three, this is an affront on the labor regime that we have in the country.
100%. Thank you very much for that question, Thabo. I think that the Cosatu and its allies in the ANC have been very successful at gaslighting and manipulating South Africans, and particularly the unemployed. Because when you look at the way in which the labor regime is constructed, it's to benefit cadres and cronies and people who are linked to organized labor. We hear them bleating about CEO salaries, but do you see union bosses declaring their salaries on an annual basis or being transparent with their financials? So I think there's an element of hypocrisy involved there. And ultimately, I think we need to be a little bit more honest in this discussion that we're having this evening. I think, secondly, it's fine to say that the effect has been that no people have lost their jobs. But what about presumptive employers wanting to get employees into the actual workforce and absorb that labor? Do you think that it's not prohibitive in that respect? And ultimately, we wouldn't sit with an unemployment rate, of, including the expanded definition, north of 40% if there wasn't a problem with our labor laws. And this has been cited by a number of research institutes, a number of universities, and I could probably counter Mr. Park's suggestion of studies with an equal amount of studies to try and prove my point. And ultimately, what we need to do is, if we're going to grow the pie, then we need to get the state out of the economy, which Cosatu and its allies have proposed over the last 30 years. And if you wanted to get things like Eskom and Transnet working, then you mustn't make them reliant on the state. We know that funding these SOEs to the tune in which the taxpayer has over the last number of years has only made them more efficient and less able to actually deliver on the services that they require. And ultimately, this has constrained our economy, and we can't just look at this through a single lens. We need to look at multiple interventions across the economy to get it growing. And if we're going to get it growing, then we need to adopt the policies that are outlined by the DA and the ones which we proposed this past Friday, because these are the ones that can generate the necessary growth for us to be able to create jobs, expand value, and make sure that more people are able to move up the opportunity ladder. What Mr. Parks is proposing this evening is actually slicing the pie and making do with what we've got, because the cadres in his alliance have extracted as much as they have at the expense of the poor and the expense of the unemployed. And ultimately, we need to focus on uplifting people rather than keeping them down. And as much as Mr. Parks likes to gaslight, I don't believe that he's being very honest in what he's saying to us this evening. And I see he's smiling there because I think he recognizes that he's gaslighting South Africans. And ultimately, he's gaslighting South Africans, and this is what the ANC and their allies have been doing for the last 30 years, gaslighting, manipulating people, saying, oh, well, you know, the DA is anti-poor, but at the end of the day, they've got an insider-outsider stitch-up where they've actually locked people into poverty and out of economic opportunity. And we should be very honest about that this evening and confront the fact that we have 10 million people who go to bed at night without anything to eat because fat cats at Cosatu don't want them to actually be able to get a job.
All right, we'll come to Matthew to respond, but touch on this as well for me, if you will. On what are you basing the view that says minimum wage is expensive for SMEs?
Well, if you look at minimum wage and you look at collective bargaining agreements as well, where big business sits with unions and dictates what the sectoral wage agreements will be, and that then gets passed on to SMMEs who have no right or no say in the actual process itself. Considering you're a fledgling business, you're not going to be able to pay the same value that a larger business would, and therefore you prohibit that person from actually employing other people. And the same goes for the minimum wage in that respect. It's fine and well to say you're a big company or you're a unionized worker and you're wanting to argue for above inflation increase on an annual basis. But how does a small company compete with that? All of the mom and pop shops, all of the people who are wanting to actually be fledgling entrepreneurs, be able to contribute towards society and be able to build a better livelihood for themselves. Ultimately, that's where we need to focus on, is making sure that we allow people to actually move up that opportunity ladder. And I think the status quo and the ANC and the Cosatu SACP Alliance's economic policy has disempowered people rather than actually empowering people to start businesses, be absorbed into the labor market and actually live a life of dignity.
Yeah. Allowing the minimum wage to be eroded by inflation, is that not similar? You're disempowering people?
I don't believe that it is, because over time, progressively, it will allow more people to enter the market. I think that there's a large willingness amongst people who are currently confined to the R0 wage by virtue of being unemployed who'd want to take up that opportunity, because ultimately you've got this choice before you. You can sit at home, be unemployed. If you qualify for an SRD grant, you can get 350 Rand. Those are your options. Because if somebody does not want to employ you at 4,000 Rand, then what else do? You sit at home. So ultimately, we need to create an opportunity for that person to move up the ladder. And granted, there are prohibitive costs such as transport and so forth. Yeah. But ultimately, it's better than earning nothing. Because if you sit at home and you earn nothing and you become unproductive, then you're not actually going to build up the kind of experience you require. You're never going to be promoted, and you're never going to be able to move up that opportunity ladder. And this is what we're saying. Get people foot in the door, allow them to build up that experience, allow them to earn, and allow them to have the kind of buying power so they can purchase goods in the economy. Yeah. But you're certainly not going to have any buying power if you're confined to 0 Rand.
But it still maintains that argument. You don't disempower others' ability to purchase. To say, well, let's disempower you in order to add more people. So let's erode your power to purchase so that we add more people. There should be a better way of doing it than that.
Well, if you look at our policy proposal, ours says to keep the minimum wage in place at this moment in time at its current level. So all existing workers would be unaffected by this if this policy was implemented tomorrow. And ultimately, over time, it would progressively allow other people to enter the labor market, considering the fact that you have to add a certain amount of value in order for an employer to consider hiring you. And I think, therefore, it's a purely logical position and one which is actually grounded in the necessary economic theory to be a success, despite what Mr. Parks may think.
Matthew Parks, let's bring you in here. Your theory around huge salaries of CEOs, you're just gaslighting South Africans because you are not equally as transparent. Transparency goes both ways. Two, that even though no jobs were lost, it's still prohibitive for would-be employers. I suppose the other argument is it's a give and take. So you can't be pushing for the state interference in, for example, things like Eskom as Cosatu, while you're saying we must grow the cake. So you need to also give up on some of those policy requirements. What do you say?
Yeah, no, look, we'll unashamedly defend the rights of workers. That's our job. Just like it's the job of the DA to defend the interests of CEOs, and they do that with great effect. I'm not sure, is a farm worker a cadre or a domestic worker a cadre? Because you managed to raise the wages. In the Durrans, a decade ago in the Western Cape, farm workers are paid as little as 6 Rand an hour. Couldn't even buy a loaf of bread if they worked half the day. Today they earn 27.58 cents, so they're improving their lives. They're more productive, they're able to spend money in the local economy, better take care of their families. I'm not sure if it's catered deployment to say that mothers who give birth to a child should be entitled to paid maternity leave. But look, the DA operates in a different circle of friends, constantia dinner parties. Now the DA says, look, this minimum wage is prohibiting employment, okay? So when did it come into effect? It came into effect 4 years ago. Unemployment didn't start 4 years ago. It's been around for a long time. And part of the reason why it's been around for a long time is that the DA, its ideological predecessors before 1994, its friends in industry, believe paying workers, the majority, an absolute pittance, and paying the CEOs a fortune is a way to grow the economy. That's not the way to grow the economy. Look at the most successful economies, the most successful societies, Scandinavia, Sweden, Germany, Japan, etc. They don't pay people a slave wage. They try to invest in people to improve their lives so they're able to spend in their local economy. This is why we're struggling all the time. Now, it's a bit strange that the DA is even to the right of business, because the minimum wage we have now is a product of a compromise, as you were saying, between business and labor and NEDLAC. We had a lot of discussions. Business wanted a little bit lower, we wanted a little bit higher. We agreed on a compromise. And we looked at what's the impact, what's the affordability of the economy, what's the affordability of SMEs, of businesses, of farmers, of employers, of domestic workers. That's why it came at a compromise, at a pegged rate, at a transitional rate for farm workers, for domestic workers, to check what's the impact. And ironically, if you had looked at 2 weeks ago, Old Mutual said they actually want to exceed the minimum wage to compete with other businesses. Woolworths said the same thing as well. So they're not struggling with it. Now let's take the example of an SME. If one reads the Minimum Wage Act and even the other labor laws, but the Minimum Wage Act specifically, SMEs or any company which is struggling to afford the minimum wage can apply for an exemption. All they have to do is just to provide their financial statements and say, yes, indeed, we generally can't afford it, and they'll be given an exemption. About 2,000 companies have applied for an exemption, half were approved. So it's not a problem. You can apply for it. The law is not so unsympathetic. But I think for us, the ultimate issue is, look, we can fight about half a cake. I think for us, ultimately, where I think hopefully we do agree with the DA, is how we grow the economy. So we've got to fix Eskom so it's reliable and affordable electricity for that restaurant to sell its food. We've got to make sure transit is working so the farmers can get their products onto the trains, through the ports, to the markets overseas. We've got to make sure municipalities are functional, that crime and corruption are dealt with. Those are the fundamental issues. But also it's about making sure people have a living wage so they can buy the goods we produce. Because if we're producing clothes and shoes, but a worker's earning so little that they can't afford it. And it's a little bit bizarre to say 4,200 Rand a month is too much. So we want to take it down to what, 2,100 Rand? It's a bit bizarre. And we wish the DA would really lead by example. The DA members of parliament, provincial legislatures and municipalities, even those run by the DA, have been very happy to give themselves increases year after year. There's no problem there. There's no issue of affordability. There's no issue of anything, consciousness, etc. But when it comes to farm workers, domestic workers, clothing factory workers, the very same people the DA will go to on election hustings and say, vote for us. Then there's a problem. We wish the DA would actually produce a pamphlet which says to the voters of Mitchells Plain, working class households who earn a minimum wage, that you earn too much, you are the cause of the problem of the economy. But look, there's not an isolated example. The DA introduced a bill to Parliament a few months ago, responsible spending bill. It proposed a 10% cut in the salaries of nurses, of teachers, of cleaners, anybody who works for the state for the next decade. So the solution is not to do the fundamental causes of the fiscal crisis in the state, which is corruption or economic growth or the economy at large. It's to say, let's see how we can pickpocket the most poorly paid members of society. Let's impoverish them further. Let's not deal with the issue of what the CEOs make, because if it was an issue about sharing the cake, then the DA would have come to Parliament and said, let's put a salary cap on what the CEOs of listed companies make. They don't do that. In fact, they vote against any hint of a little bit of an attempt to address the obscene wage gap we have in society. And again, we didn't go and quote for the minimum wage discussion, we didn't go and quote on North Korea, on Albania, for example. We researched that showed what happened in the US. It's been very effective. What happened in Brazil, a very similar country with very similar racial inequality and poverty stats and economic stats to us. It's worked wonders. So it's a bit strange that the DA said, let's race to the bottom. Yeah. But look, it's fine. The DA has been honest. We appreciate that. They are opposed to workers' rights. We understand that. And ultimately, that's why we all tell workers not to vote for the DA. It's just a pity the DA doesn't go to Mitchells Plain, to Bonteheuwel, or to Bishop Lavis, where it asks workers to vote for it. Yet when it goes to Parliament, it votes against the interests of those very same workers.
Right, let's tackle this one last bit before I run out of time. And I suppose, Matthew Cuthbert, you can also respond to some of the issues that Matthew is raising there, particularly around the question of who is a cadre and who they are speaking for in terms of workers. But I also want you to tackle the question of administrative prices, where Cosatu is calling you out of being hypocritical, where you are more than happy to raise the price of electricity and water in the Western Cape, yet you are raising issue about administrative prices.
100%. So let's look at the 37,000 millionaire managers, right, who are largely Cosatu affiliated members. And you don't see Cosatu bleating about the fact that they take above inflation increases on an annual basis. So if Mr. Parks wants to engage in a tit for tat and selective morality, then we should do this properly. Because ultimately, they are happy for union bosses to earn in excess of R1 million themselves. And I'm not sure what Mr. Parks earns, but if he wants to disclose that, he could disclose that to members of the public. And I'm sure that would apply to a number of other senior union officials. And similarly, the 37,000 millionaire managers who don't contribute to frontline service delivery continue to extract from the state, give us one of the highest public service wage bills in the world, as a percentage of our entire economy, and yet they are happy to come and tell us that they are pro-poor and they are pro-service delivery. And they want to come and talk about the city of Cape Town, a city who has focused almost 70% of its budget on infrastructure in the most poor and vulnerable of areas across the city. But I suppose that wouldn't be convenient for Mr. Parks to wade into. Secondly, in respect of the second question regarding administered prices, ultimately, because we've had an uncompetitive energy market in particular over time, because of state involvement, the fact that Eskom was looted by Mr. Parks and his cadres, The fact is we do not have a competitive electricity sector. We've failed to diversify over time. And ultimately, that has raised the input costs for business. Things such as electricity prices, if we look at rail similarly too. And this has made it more expensive to do business and has obviously added a price premium on top of what it should have actually cost for businesses to get those critical inputs so they could produce goods and then be able to sell those goods into other markets. And if we didn't have the kind of state involvement that we've had over the longest time, then we'd find ourselves in a much better and more efficient economic situation, but we don't. And I think that once again, it's fine and well to say, well, we want to promote reforms at Transnet, we want to promote reforms at Eskom, but who are the ones who were implementing the sort of state-centric policy over the last 30 years? And the 5 cabinet ministers, including the president himself, who were former trade unionists, tell me that there's not some sort of agenda to actually put forward an economic policy platform that puts unions at the center of the economy and excludes the unemployed and the poor. And ultimately, we must take ourselves back in history to 2012, particularly with the introduction of the Youth Employment Tax Incentive or the Youth Wage Subsidy, when the DA actually marched to Cosatu to lobby them to support this particular initiative. And what did Cosatu do? Cosatu decided that they were going to violently assault members of the DA and members of the public because they couldn't get their way through the battle of ideas, so they thought they were going to resort to violence. And ultimately, that is what Mr. Parks and his organization have done over the longest time. They think they can threaten people, they think that they can damage public infrastructure, and there's no accountability. And as the DA, we are saying the time is over. Ultimately, we must protect workers' rights, but we must make sure that unions are held accountable for the negative role they play in our economy and the fact that they are a net contributor to the unemployment crisis that this country faces.
Matthew Parks, a final word from you as we wrap up.
Yeah. No, look, I mean, the day, just reeks of hypocrisy. NERSA actually had to call the city of Cape Town to order because it raises electricity price above the national average, above what is legally entitled to. It's a bit strange that DA is bleating about senior management salaries, because that's what Matt is referring to. It's not Cosatu. Those are DGs, they're not members of Cosatu. Yet the managers at the city of Cape Town earn more than what ministers earn, in fact, double. Yet the municipal cleaners earn a pittance. And if the DA's governance record is a model to look at, let's look at the violence in Khayelitsha, let's look at the homelessness in Khayelitsha, let's look at the state of violence in Manenberg. It's not a pretty story at all. Might be a good story in Constantia, sure, not in Manenberg or Khayelitsha. In fact, it's a pity that Matt hasn't attended the budget hearings at Parliament, because we've actually raised consistently there's a need to reduce what senior management earns, not just in the public service, but actually at entities like Eskom, and to shift those resources to nurses, to teachers, to police officers who provide the frontline services. We actually would love to see less management and more frontline workers. Perhaps we might actually have an agreement with the DA in that regard. In terms of unions, look, unions are not some sort of creature sitting on a hill somewhere. They're nurses, they're farm workers, they're clothing workers, they're municipal cleaners, they're police officers. So it's fine to pick on them, because I think that's the stance of the DA, is to blame the victim. But it's these workers who, when the politician was sitting comfortably at home during COVID-19, who were risking their lives, dying at extraordinary rates, and being actually earned a pittance. Obviously, very same workers whose pension funds are invested throughout these listed companies, where the CEOs basically pay themselves obscene wages. And it's the very same workers who actually build this economy, who have built the mining industry, who pave our roads, who take care of our kids at schools. So I'm not sure when workers say they want to earn a living wage so they can buy electricity, can pay for transport, can buy food, can maybe even take out the family for an outing on a weekend just to enjoy life. That's the problem the DA gets offended by. Doesn't get offended. They never issued a single statement about Neil Froneman has 300 million rand salary at Lonmin. They never raised an issue about the banks paying the CEOs 150,000 rand every single day, but a cashier wouldn't make that in 2 years. That's not a problem. The DA has a problem to see poor people just trying to survive, not even a huge salary, just trying to survive. That's the focus of the DA. That's a real pity, because we need to have a sober discussion about how to grow the economy. We can't sustain a 41% unemployment rate. Right. But for us, it's about fixing electricity, fixing the infrastructure, and expanding employment programs like the presidential employment stimulus to help young people, as Matt correctly says, right, get a chance to earn a salary, experience, and enter the labor market, but not to pickpocket nurses and teachers.
Matthew Parks, Matthew Cuthbert, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on. Nkweba on WhatsApp saying, evening Tabo, due to scarcity of job opportunities for me, it would be better to settle for less than nothing. It's quite evident that the economy of South Africa is not ready to absorb all job seekers. Some of your thoughts. I appreciate Gweba. Thank you very much for weighing in tonight. We'll continue in a moment with what's making news here on In Focus. Back in a moment.